Hello everyone, this is Ella Massey. Today is April 8th, 2019. On today, I will be sharing a basic overview of the Bible. So let's get started. The Bible is composed of 66 books, which are divided into two major sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, which can be grouped together in these categories: books of the law, historical books, the prophet, and poetic books. Let's take a closer look at each of these categories. The books of the law are also known as the Pentateuch or Torah. Pentateuch means 5 books. Torah means law or teachings. These first 5 books of the Old Testament were written by Moses, and it goes from Genesis to Deuteronomy. These books deal with the fall of man and God's selection of his people. Also deals with Israel's deliverance from Egypt and gives a detailed explanation of God's law. Historical books goes from Joshua to Esther. These books deal with Israel's conquest of the Promised Land and their general failure to fulfill their covenant obligation to God. The prophets. The major prophets goes from Isaiah to Daniel. These books focus on the sins of God's people, God's judgment, and the future promise of the new covenant through the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. The minor prophets goes from Hosea to Malachi. These books denounces sins of God's people, means of God's judgment, and gives ultimate hope through prophecies of Christ's coming and redemptive work. Poetic books goes from Job to Lamentations. These books deal with a variety of life issues. Let's move on now to the New Testament. There are 27 books in the New Testament, which can be grouped together in the following categories. So let's take a closer look at each of these categories. Matthew. Matthew writes as a Jew to Jews. He represents Jesus as the Messiah who fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. Mark writes to the action-minded Romans. He represents Christ as the busy servant of God who demonstrates supernatural power over nature, disease, and demons. Luke, he writes to the Gentiles, giving us a picture of Christ as a fulfillment of compassion for the poor and the sinful. John, he gives us a theological portrait of Christ. In Acts, Luke writes and gives us an emphasis on Jesus' continued work from heaven by the Holy Spirit to his church. The epistles or the letters. Romans. This was written to the believers at Rome, setting forth the need for and the plan of salvation. 1 Corinthians. It deals with church problems such as church cliques and fractions. 2 Corinthians. This chapter deals with Paul's apostleship and his motivation for ministry. Galatians. It combats the problems of legalism and asserts Christian freedom through justification by faith alone. Ephesians. It reveals the eternal plan and purpose of God and salvation. Philippians. It was written to assure the believers of God's unfailing purpose through Paul's imprisonment. Colossians. This chapter deals with the sufficiency of Christ. 1 Thessalonians. This chapter deals with sexual purity. 2 Thessalonians. It deals with correcting errors regarding Christ's second coming. 1 Timothy. This chapter deals with instructions on how to have a healthy church. 2 Timothy. This chapter deals with the sufficiency of Christ and scriptures. Titus. This chapter gives instructions on how to organize a new church in a pagan society. Philemon. This is Paul's letter in behalf of a runaway converted slave. Hebrews. It teaches the superiority of Christ to all that these Jew believers left behind in Judaism. James. It covers the purpose of God and God's purpose in trials. 1 Peter teaches believers how they can endure suffering for Christ in a way that pleases God. 2 Peter warns against the infiltration of false teachers and how to identify them. 1 John. This book deals with how to biblically based assurance of salvation. 2 John. This is a letter of encouragement to Christian women warning against aiding false teachers. 3 John. This chapter deals with hospitality. Jude. It deals with warning against false teachers and how to rescue those who have been influenced by them. And the last book is prophecy, it's Revelation. This book deals with the second coming of Christ and the final acts in God's unfolding drama of redemption. In closing, now that you have learned how the Bible is laid out, how will you study the Bible? I hope you were blessed and encouraged on getting an overview of the Bible. So until next time, stay thankful